IMGs can now practice medicine in America without doing residency, and 99% of you have no idea how quickly the laws are changing. You know that feeling when people ask what you do for work and you can't say doctor even though you are? When you're stuck in jobs that waste your years of training? Here's what changed. 12 states and counting said your training counts and opened new pathways. When I was at Harvard, I had a friend living in Boston who was an orthopedic surgeon from South Korea. But through these exact pathways, he's now a fully licensed practicing orthopedic surgeon in America. I'll share the 12 most important things you need to know about practicing in the US without residency training, starting with number 12. Number 12 is that the doctor shortage is getting worse every year. Here's a fact that should shock you. America will be missing up to 86,000 doctors by 2036, according to the Association of American Medical Colleges. Here's the math that explains why this crisis is getting worse. First, we're training about 36,000 new doctors each year through residency programs. But over 40% of current doctors are already 55 or older and will reach retirement age within the next decade. That's nearly 500,000 doctors who will hit retirement age very soon. Meanwhile, our population is projected to grow by 8.4% by 2036, but the number of people over 65 who need much more medical care is growing by 34%. That means that we'll have 28 million more Americans total, but 19 million more seniors who visit doctors 3 times as often as younger people. It's like a workforce where nearly half the employees will reach retirement age in the next 10 years, but you're only hiring enough new people to replace about 3% of your workforce each year. And the craziest part, we have thousands of international medical graduates, that's doctors who trained outside the United States, who are already fully trained doctors in their home countries. But they can't practice here because they can't get into our residency programs. We're forcing experienced surgeons to drive taxis while patients wait months to see a doctor. This crisis is what's pushing states to create these new pathways. They're basically saying, if Congress won't fix the bottleneck, we'll build a different road. That different road started with 12 brave states that decided to completely change the rules. Number 11 is the 12 states that broke the system forever. These aren't tiny rural states doing experiments. Instead, Florida, Illinois, Massachusetts, Tennessee, and others are leading a revolution that's spreading across America. Here's the timeline of how quickly things have changed. In 2021, Washington State started a pilot program. They put 40 international doctors to work in underserved areas. In 2023, Tennessee and Illinois passed permanent laws. This made it real and legal. In 2024, however, the floodgates opened. Florida, Virginia, Massachusetts, Louisiana, Wisconsin, Idaho, and Iowa all passed similar laws. And in 2025, more states are starting their programs and others are writing new laws. Here are some of the key differences you need to understand so that you can practice in the United States. First is, what is a permanent pathway? Note that most states use this. In this case, you're doing supervised practice for 2 to 3 years, and then you're going to get a medical license forever. Other kind of program is a temporary program. Note that few states do this. You would get a license that expires and might or might not be renewable. Note that a permanent pathway means that you end up with the exact same medical license as someone who did a US residency. There's no restrictions, no asterisks, and no second-class status, at least when it comes to having a medical license. But why would it make sense that these states are the first movers? First, many of them have severe doctor shortages, especially in rural areas. Second, some hospitals were threatening to close emergency rooms. Third, patients were driving hours for basic care. And then fourth, this created a lot of political pressure from mayors and county commissioners to get something done. Both Republican and Democratic states are doing this because sick patients don't care about politics. What makes this a revolution is that before 2021, the only way for any international medical graduate to practice in America was through US residency. Now there's a completely different path. But before you get excited, you need to understand that these states didn't make it easy. The requirements are actually very tough. So number 10 on our list is that the qualification requirements are stricter than you might think. But these states didn't just open the floodgates, they built a very narrow bridge that only the most experienced and qualified doctors can cross. These are the requirements that virtually every single state demands everyone to have accomplished. So first is that you need to pass every USMLE exam. Most states require you to have passed Step 1, Step 2 CK, and in most cases, also Step 3. Along with this is that you need to get ECFMG certification. You also need to have the legal right to work in the United States, a clean record, meaning no malpractice or licensing problems anywhere in the world, And finally, you need to basically have a job offer from an approved employer before you apply. ECFMG certification comes from the ECFMG, which stands for the Educational Commission for Foreign Medical Graduates. Getting this ECFMG certification proves your foreign medical school meets the US standards and that you know enough medicine to be safe. One thing to note is that the experience requirements for how long you've been in practice will vary by state. The lower bar states require at least 3 or more years of practice after medical school. These would be places like Tennessee and Illinois. Higher bar states require more practice after medical school. States that fall in this category would be Virginia, Iowa, and Louisiana that require 5 or more years of practice after medical school. Note that in most cases, this medical practice can be either residency training abroad or years working as a licensed doctor. As far as the job requirement goes, you must have an employer that's willing to both hire and supervise you before the state will even consider your application. We'll talk more about visa and other sort of permanent residency requirements later, but the employer requirement is a big one. Specifically, the hospital or clinic has to agree to supervise your medical practice, where they're basically telling the state, hey, we vouch for this doctor. Usually these employers are going to be in underserved areas or where there's a shortage in a particular specialty. They're taking legal responsibility for your patients during your supervision. When we say underserved, this means places typically that don't have enough doctors. Usually these would be places like small towns or poor neighborhoods where many doctors may not want to work. Think of it this way. They want doctors who are already proven professionals, not necessarily just medical students who need basic training. These requirements may eliminate a large majority of international medical graduates. You need to be experienced, clean, and have someone willing to hire you. That in and of itself is going to create some hurdles for many people. However, if you meet those tough requirements, here's exactly what the supervised practice looks like. Number 9 is supervised practice replaces residency training. Instead of doing a 3 to 4 year residency where you're basically a trainee, instead through these programs, you can do a 2 to 3 year supervised practice stint where you're a real doctor getting paid a real salary. Here's how supervision actually works. You would work as a licensed doctor under another licensed doctor called your supervising physician. The supervisor takes legal responsibility for your patients at first, and eventually, gradually, you're going to get more independence as you prove that you understand US medicine. They'll file regular progress reports that go to the state medical board, and at the end, your supervisor can recommend you for full licensure. So what would you be learning during this time? First, you'd be learning about US healthcare technology, things like the electronic medical records, computerized ordering systems. Second, you'd be learning about American medical culture. How do you talk to US patients? How do you do family meetings? How do you do end-of-life discussions, which may be very different from in your home country? Third, you'd be learning about local hospital protocols and procedures that would be specific to your particular workplace. Next, you'd be learning about healthcare business, things like insurance systems, billing, prior authorizations, as well as having legal requirements, so things like US malpractice law and documentation standards. Typically during year 1, you'd have much closer supervision, learning the ropes, adapting to the US system. By year 2, more and more physicians would be gaining more independence, handling more complex cases, and/or preparing for full. Then by year 3, at least in some cases, you would be moving towards minimal supervision, having a final evaluation, and preparing for full license. Here are some of the big differences going the pathway of supervised practice versus residency. In supervised practice, you'll get paid like a real doctor, meaning that you would be paid as an attending, not necessarily as a resident. Now granted, because it's a supervisory role, you may not get as much as the people that are supervising you. However, most likely you're going to be making more than the resident. You also may have more autonomy and respect. You're also less likely to be rotating through different specialties. You're only going to be practicing in your particular field. And after the supervised period, you get a full unrestricted medical license, exactly the same as someone who did a US residency. By unrestricted, that means that you can practice anywhere in that state, change jobs freely, and apply for hospital privileges, plus do everything that any other licensed doctor can do. So if that sounds great, the next thing that we're going to talk about can show you how there's even greater advantages of doing the supervised route. The number 8 thing to understand is that underserved areas can actually be career gold mines. Everyone thinks that working in underserved areas is a punishment. Actually, it's the fastest way to build not only wealth, but also job security in medicine. Here's why underserved areas can make you a lot more money. First of all, there's almost no competition for these jobs. By definition, they are underserved, and so sometimes you're going to be the only doctor who applies for positions here. Second, hospitals are desperate to hire. You have all the negotiating power in these situations. As a consequence, salaries are often 20 to even 50% higher than in urban areas to attract doctors. In most white-collar fields like law or business, typically in the bigger cities like Boston or LA or Chicago, those are the places that you can get the jobs that pay the most. In medicine, it's actually the opposite. Oftentimes, the most desirable cities have the most people that want to live there, and as such, hospitals don't have to pay nearly as high of a salary in order to attract physicians. In contrast, rural areas have a lower cost of living and can also have much higher salaries, including things like signing bonuses, loan forgiveness, or housing allowances that are commonly offered there as opposed to in major cities. Underserved areas can also fast track you to partnership or practice ownership, and the patients are typically extremely loyal because good doctors are less common. So what are some real examples of what underserved actually mean? First might be something like a rural town. So these would be towns where the population is under 20,000. Maybe they'll have one small hospital and a number of surrounding farming communities. Others would be things like inner city clinics. These would be community health centers that are serving low-income patients in urban areas. Other practice scenarios may be federally qualified health centers or FQHCs. These are special clinics that get government funding to serve people who can't afford regular healthcare. Another would be critical shortage specialties, things like psychiatry, primary care, or emergency medicine, which may be in shortage in a variety of different places. All this adds up to business advantages that nobody talks about. Less medical politics and administrative bureaucracy, some loan forgiveness programs that can eliminate your medical school debt, path to owning your own practice much earlier when older doctors retire, strong relationships with grateful patients, and you can often qualify for special visa programs like Conrad 30. And remember, after your commitment, you're not tied to that area. In most states, after 2 to 3 years, you can move anywhere in the state. For some states, you must stay in underserved areas for a bit longer, but the reality is that many doctors stay because the benefits are better than competitive urban areas. While other doctors fight for scraps in oversaturated city markets, you're building wealth where you're desperately needed. One doctor we heard of moved from Mexico City to rural Tennessee. In Mexico, he made about $30,000 per year as an emergency doctor. In Tennessee, he makes about 10 times that per year. Plus, he got a $50,000 signing bonus, and the hospital paid off his medical school loans. But there's one career limitation that you need to plan for that nobody talks about. That's number 7, board certification that creates career ceilings. You can get a medical license through these programs, but there's one credential that they can't give you, and it could limit your career in ways that you need to understand. Let's talk about board certification. What is it? Board certification is an extra credential beyond your medical license. It proves that you're an expert in a specific area like cardiology or surgery or anesthesiology. Note that for most hospitals, it can be a requirement for certain jobs. In addition, it can be required by insurance companies to get paid for some procedures. It takes years to get and requires passing some very hard exams. You can think of a medical license like a driver's license. It lets you legally drive. Board certification is like being a certified truck driver. It proves that you can handle the big, complicated stuff. The current problem is that specialty boards only accept doctors who did US or Canadian residency training. What that means is that your foreign residency does not count, no matter how good it was. This has the potential to create 2 classes of doctors: people that are board certified and people that are not board certified. Therefore, if you go the supervised practice route, the real world impact on your career can be this. Some hospitals won't hire you for certain positions without board certification. Their insurance companies might pay you less for some procedures, or may not even reimburse you at all. Academic medical centers usually require board certifications for faculty positions, and some subspecialty fellowships are nearly impossible to get without having board certification, or at least being board eligible. Where there are some fields that board certification matters a ton, there are some fields where the certification matters less. These would be things like primary care or family medicine. Many jobs here don't require it. Hospital medicine, specifically hospitalist positions, often don't require it. In addition to that, emergency medicine, there are some emergency departments that are more flexible. Urgent care and walk-in clinics also usually don't require it, and some government jobs. VA hospitals and public health often don't require having board certification. In addition to this, if you're a specialist that wants to continue to practice your specialty in the United States without doing a residency, there are some workarounds that are currently developing. Some hospitals are changing their rules to accept state-licensed doctors. In addition, there's pressure building on specialty boards to recognize foreign training. These new alternative certification pathways are already being discussed. Some states in particular are also considering their own certification programs. This isn't a deal breaker, but you do need to choose your specialty and career path knowing this limitation can potentially exist. If your ultimate goal is to be a subspecialist requiring board certification, you might still need to pursue traditional residency. But if you want to practice primary care or hospital medicine, these pathways can work perfectly. Despite these limitations, hospitals are fighting to hire these international doctors. Here's why. Number 6 is that hospitals are desperately competing for these doctors. Hospitals aren't just accepting these international doctors, they're actively recruiting them and offering better deals than they might even give to US trained residents. So why might these hospitals love hiring through these programs? First, they get experienced attending level doctors, not necessarily trainees who need supervision. Second, they can fill positions that have been empty for months or even years. International doctors are often more grateful and loyal than US graduates. They're also willing to work in locations where US doctors won't go, and it can be much cheaper than hiring temporary doctors or locum tenens. Locum tenens means temporary doctors. Hospitals hire them when they can't find permanent doctors, and the downside, however, is they can often cost 2 to 3 times as much as regular doctors, and they're not staying long, almost by definition. So here's what hospitals are doing to attract these foreign doctors. First, they're working hard to update their credentialing policies to accept non-board certified doctors. Second, they're creating special orientation programs to help international doctors adapt. Third, they're setting up formal supervision and mentorship programs. Fourth, they're actively recruiting at international medical conferences. And fifth, they're offering better benefits packages than they offer to some residents. The business case for hospitals is pretty clear. Empty doctor positions cost hospitals millions in lost revenue. Emergency rooms might have to close without enough doctors, patient satisfaction scores drop when there aren't enough physicians, existing doctors burn out from being overworked, creating even more problems with having enough doctors on staff. Finally, locum tenens doctors can cost $200 to $300 per hour versus $100 to $150 for permanent doctors. A real example of this was Mercy Hospital in rural Missouri, which had their emergency room on the verge of closing. They hired 3 international doctors through Tennessee's program. Now their ER is fully staffed, patient satisfaction is up, and they're making money again. That said, there are implementation challenges that hospitals still face. You have to find doctors that are willing to supervise. This is going to take time, and it's going to increase their responsibility. Hospitals also have an increase in administrative work to set up these programs. There's lots and lots of paperwork. Liability insurance also has to be considered because now you're making sure that everyone has to be covered, and there has to be integration with existing medical staff. Some US doctors might be resistant. From a hospital's perspective, hiring an experienced international doctor is often better than hiring a fresh US resident. You get someone who already knows medicine and has been practicing for some time. The early results prove the strategy is working exactly as planned. That brings us to number 5. Early results show remarkable success. We don't have to guess anymore if this works. We already have hard data from the states that have started first, and the results are better than anyone might have expected. Washington State, which was the first to have a pilot program, shared their results recently. They had 40 licensed international doctors in the first few years. All were placed in underserved areas as per the requirements. They had 0 major patient safety incidents that were reported. In addition to that, the patient satisfaction scores were equal to or better than the baseline. Doctor retention rate was also much higher than expected. As we discussed earlier, even though in many of these programs you get a full license after 2 or 3 years and you could move somewhere else, most stayed after their commitment. In addition, several small hospitals avoided closing their emergency rooms. Data from other states is also very encouraging. In Tennessee, they received over 100 inquiries in the first 6 months alone after their law passed. In Illinois, it was estimated that 50 to 100 qualified applicants will apply in 2025. In Massachusetts, 5 major hospital systems have already set up approved training programs. In Louisiana, hospital associations report enthusiastic interest from members, and in Virginia, the first cohort of 12 doctors started supervised practice in late 2024. Quality and safety measures have been very encouraging. Patient outcome data shows international doctors perform as well as US trained doctors in many cases. Supervised evaluations report smooth integration into care teams. There's been no increase in malpractice claims or patient complaints relative to the baseline, and state medical boards report no significant increase in disciplinary issues. That said, challenges have been identified. The evidence is crystal clear. When done right, these programs work for patients, doctors, and hospitals. And if you're a foreign trained doctor who's wondering, is this right for me? Look at the retention rate. The high retention rate of doctors who start out in underserved areas who then go on to stay, the fact that most doctors are staying in their underserved areas even after their commitment ends, suggests that these jobs are actually good careers, not just stepping stones. There's one factor that determines whether you can even participate in these programs. This brings us to number 4. Your visa status determines everything. Your immigration status isn't just paperwork, it's the single factor that determines whether these programs are available to you or completely impossible. Let's go through scenario number 1. Let's say you're an American who went to medical school in the Caribbean, Europe, or anywhere outside the United States. From an immigration standpoint, you have no issues at all. You can work anywhere in the United States. If you wanted to take advantage of this program, it would be very simple. You would just apply directly to any of the 12 states, get a job offer, and start supervised practice. Scenario 2 is not far off. That's the permanent residents or green card holders. Let's say that you have a green card through family, work, or other means. From an immigration standpoint, you have the same status as US citizens, meaning there's no barrier for you to work or live anywhere in the United States. The process is going to be virtually identical to US citizens. You can apply to any state and you'll have no visa sponsorship requirements. You too will have full access to all the programs. Scenario 3 is H-1B visa holders. If you are a current H-1B visa holder, you would already know it. This would be you're currently in the US on a work visa, maybe you're doing research or working in healthcare in some other capacity. If you're already working or living in the United States, you basically would need 2 sponsors in order to participate in supervised care instead of going to a US residency. First, the hospital itself would have to sponsor your H-1B visa and agree to supervise your medical license. In reality, this is probably not as hard as it might seem, since most hospitals that are willing to do medical supervision are also most likely going to be willing to sponsor an H-1B visa in the first place. So the process would be relatively straightforward. You need to find a hospital, then they would need to sponsor your H-1B visa, and they would also have to be willing to supervise your medical training. Then, once you find someone who's willing to do both of those, you would apply for a state license. Of note, H-1B is a temporary work visa that lets skilled workers stay in the US for up to 6 years. Employers have to sponsor you and prove that they need your skills. Scenario 4 would be J-1 visa holder. Let's say that you're on a J-1 exchange visitor visa. This is often used by doctors doing research or observerships. The big problem here is that for J-1 visas, they have a home country requirement, meaning that after your visa expires, you have to return home for 2 years before getting other US visas. The solution to this is what's known as a Conrad 30 waiver. A Conrad 30 waiver lets J-1 doctors skip the home country requirement if they work in an underserved area for 3 years. This is a perfect match, since these state programs for supervised practice require essentially underserved area work anyways. So a Conrad 30 might apply perfectly to that particular situation. In reality, what this means is that you need an immigration lawyer to help you figure this out on a case-by-case basis, well beyond the scope of this video. The final scenario would be if you have no current US work authorization. Let's say that you're living abroad or in the US without work permission. The hard truth is that you need to get a work visa first, then worry about getting medical licensing. The most common path here is that you need to find a hospital that's willing to sponsor an H-1B visa, then do the supervised practice program. In reality, this could take 1 to 2 years just for the visa process. So if you want to do this, start building relationships with hospitals now, even before you can work. For my friend from Boston, he was basically going to conferences all the time and trying to just network. He would present his research, he would try to find if there was some way in which he could do work as a supervised physician. The hospital that agrees to supervise your medical training usually also needs to sponsor your work visa, so you need employers who can do both. Knowing your visa situation, here's how to choose which states give you the best shot at success. Number 3 is knowing state by state where to focus your efforts and which state is going to be best for you. Note that not all 12 states offer the same opportunities. Some are gold mines, others might even be traps. Here's how to choose wisely. I've organized these into tiers so that you can best organize your efforts. Your tier 1 states are what I would consider to be your best bets. Illinois is the gold standard. In this case, the experience required is 3 or more years of practice abroad. The pathway length is only 2 years of supervised practice. The special advantage here is what's known as the ombudsman program. An ombudsman is someone whose job it is to help you navigate complicated government processes. Think of it like having a personal guide through the licensing maze. If a lot of these terms and things like that sound really confusing, this might be one to put near the top of your list. In addition to that, the market size is very large with many opportunities. The reason why it's tier 1 is that they hired that ombudsman, a full-time person whose only job it is to help international doctors through this process. Florida is another one of the tier 1 programs. The experience required is 4 or more years of practice abroad, and the pathway length is only 2 years of supervised practice. The special advantage here is that Florida is a huge state with lots of hospitals. The market size is very large, especially when you consider that there's a very large aging population. For those of you that don't live in the United States, Florida is famous for the retirement communities. It's a very sunny place with great weather where a lot of retirees go to spend their golden years. The reason why Florida is tier 1 is that there's so many opportunities that you have and there's lots of choices. Tennessee is another one of the tier 1 programs. The experience required is 3 or more years of practice abroad, and the pathway length is also 2 years of supervised practice. The special advantage here is that it's the longest track record, and it's a proven system. The market size may not be super large, but it is growing. The reason reason why it's tier 1 is that they've worked out all the kinks and have success stories. Massachusetts is the final of what I would consider to be the tier 1 programs at this stage of the game. They only require 1 or more year abroad of practice. This is the lowest bar of any of the programs that we have on this list. For the pathway length, however, is about 4 years total through 3 different steps. The special advantage is that there are major medical centers and teaching hospitals. The market size is large with prestigious institutions. The reason why it's tier 1 is that there's multiple pathways and high quality training environments. Next on our list are the tier 2 states. These are good, but have some limitations. Virginia is the first up. The experience required is 5 or more years of practice abroad, which is a pretty high bar. Like many of the others, their pathway length is 2 years of unsupervised practice. The limitation is that you must work in shortage areas and only primary care or psychiatry. Now, in fairness, in practice, this is true of many of the other states. However, this is actually written into the rules for this particular state. The reason why I consider it to be tier 2 is that it's got high requirements for experience required and there's relatively limited scope. Idaho is next on our list of tier 2 states. The experience required is 3 or more years of practice abroad, and the pathway length is 3 years of supervised practice, which is longer than most. The advantage is that it's got immigration-friendly policies. The reason why it's tier 2 is that Idaho is a small state with relatively limited opportunities, relative to the other states at least. Iowa is next on our list. The experience required is 5 or more years, which is again a pretty high bar. The pathway length is also 3 years of supervised practice, which is longer than most. The focus here is that it's heavily rural. The reason why it's tier 2 is that it's got high requirements and a relatively long commitment. The final states on our list are emerging opportunities, the first of which is Washington. Washington is converting their successful pilot program to a permanent program. If you'll recall from our previous discussion, a permanent program allows you to get a full license eventually. It has a track record of the 40 initial doctors that were successfully placed, the advantage here being that it's a proven model moving to permanent status. Louisiana is next on our list. This is a brand new program that started in 2024. The advantage is that the hospitals are very enthusiastic about participating. The model here is that it will give you a full license with 2-year restriction instead of a provisional license then leading to a full license. Wisconsin is another state to keep our eyes on. The law passed in 2024 and they're just implementing it now. The advantage is that it's a Midwest location with good opportunities. I grew up in Minnesota, which is a neighboring state. For details, they're still working out some of the specific requirements. Overall, if you want to practice in one of these states, your best strategy is to qualify for multiple tier 1 states, then choose based on specific job opportunities when you're ready to apply. Here are some factors to consider when choosing. First, how many years of experience do you have? Second, what's your visa status and immigration needs? Third, what's your specialty and career goals? Fourth, what's your family situation and location preferences? And then finally, what are your cost of living and salary expectations? Understanding your state options is important, but here's what this means for everyone in healthcare, not just international graduates. The number 2 thing to know is that this changes the game for everyone. Even if you're a US medical student who's never even thought about these programs, this revolution is changing your career in ways that you need to understand. For US medical students, this may mean more competition moving forward. These programs have the potential to add thousands or more of experienced doctors to the job market. This will have geographic impacts that are still to play out. Competition is going to increase in popular cities as international doctors eventually move there after they've done their time in underserved areas. This may paradoxically create opportunities as more positions open up in underserved areas as the barriers decrease. This also creates networking opportunities since building relationships with international colleagues becomes more valuable. For current international medical graduates, this is huge. It's an alternative pathway, meaning that you no longer have to choose between residency or nothing. From a strategic standpoint, you still need to weigh the pros and cons of traditional residency versus these new pathways. Geographically, you're going to have to consider which states align with your career goals and family needs. And then from a timing perspective, you want to understand that early adopters are often going to get better positions and terms, since the most desperate hospitals are going to try to fill their spots earliest, and so early adopters are likely going to have an advantage moving forward. The other thing to consider for IMGs is specialty implications. Some specialties are going to work better with these pathways than others. As we've seen, oftentimes primary care specialties slot in very nicely. Now granted, my friend that's an orthopedic surgeon was an orthopedic surgeon and is currently practicing as an orthopedic surgeon. So these pathways can still allow you to practice as a specialist. However, there are more hurdles that you're going to need to overcome. The medical field is becoming more flexible about how doctors enter practice, and that creates opportunities for everyone who's paying attention. The number 1 thing that you need to know is that 2025 to 2026 is the window of maximum opportunity. We're at the most important moment in medical licensing history. What you do in the next 18 months could determine your entire career. So why is 2025 to 2026 the tipping point? The reason is that more states are coming online. Texas, Georgia, North Carolina, and Arizona are all considering similar legislation. In addition to that, programs are reaching maturity. The first cohorts are graduating, and they're proving that the model works. Hospital adoption is also accelerating. More and more hospitals are setting up programs and competing for candidates. Immigration policy is starting to be coordinated. Federal agencies are starting to align visa practices with state programs. What this means is that early adopters have an advantage. The first movers are getting the best positions and more favorable terms. Here are just a few of the states actively considering legislation in 2025 to 2026. The big one is Texas. If Texas passes a law, it would double the opportunities nationwide. Bills have been introduced and hospital associations are supporting it. From a market size perspective, this would be the largest state with these particular pathways. For timeline, we're looking at possible passage in the 2025 legislative session. Georgia is another state where legislation is pending, and there's bipartisan support already emerging. This would open up potential major medical centers in Atlanta. North Carolina is another state where bills have been introduced in both chambers of Congress. Here you've got major academic medical centers and research hospitals. The medical profession is changing faster than ever. Understanding these changes isn't just helpful, it's essential for anyone who wants to practice medicine in America. Whether you're an international medical graduate looking for alternatives to residency or a US student planning your career, these pathways represent the future of medical licensing. The question isn't whether this will continue, it's whether you'll be ready when the opportunities arrive. So what are your next steps? How do you position yourself for success? First, you want to check your USMLE scores and your ECFMG status. You want to make sure that everything is current. This month, research the 12 states and identify which ones match your experience level so that you know which would make the most sense to apply to. Over the next 3 months, start networking with hospitals in underserved areas in your target state. This will obviously be easier if you live in the United States to begin with. Then, in an ongoing basis, if you need visa sponsorship, begin building relationships with employers who can provide both job and visa support. The medical profession is changing faster than ever, and understanding these IMG licensing pathways is just the beginning. Whether you're planning to use these new state programs or taking the traditional residency route, you still need to master the boards. That's exactly why our next video breaks down the complete UWorld strategy that helped me score in the top 0.1%. We'll show you the 5 levels of mastery that make 260+ scores virtually inevitable, even if you're starting below passing.